Having been released in 2004, the world of Warcraft has never been known for its multi-threading capabilities. Because the game has been built upon the same underlying structure first developed as far back as 2001, even the modern Battle for Azeroth doesn't take advantage of modern multi-core processors. However, with the current PTR patch 8.1, now Blizzard has actually enabled some new functionality within the game that allows some multi-threading to occur. In this video, we're going to explore just how good this new multi-threading is. Wowhead has already released an article discussing these changes briefly, and they did some of their own tests, and the link to that is in this video's description. In addition, what I'll be showing you here are three different settings: DirectX 11, DirectX 12, and then DirectX 12 with a few modifications to the PTR's config file, which allows some of these multi-threading capabilities to really kick in. Our test system is using a 2950X THREADRIPPER. This is a 16-core 32-thread processor, and this is a nice processor to test with this because there's really no way that the game is going to use all of these threads and cores, so we'll get a better sense of just how many cores and threads the game is able to use in the new 8.1 patch changes. The rest of the information is also available on screen, and the software used to record the frame rates and frame times includes Fraps, OCAT, MSI Afterburner, RTSS, and then of course we're using WoW version 8.1.0 from the PTR. The tests were conducted with the following settings in the graphics, advanced, and sound menus. One note is that we tested at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K resolution. We were testing at the 10 graphical preset settings, and music was looped despite what is shown on screen. The test location is a static screen. There's no movement of the character atop the Great Seal in Zul'Dazar. This location was picked because it actually is a very low FPS location. If you go stand where my character is standing, you'll find that your FPS is probably pretty low. And each test was ran for 2 minutes, and each of these tests were ran in triplicate, and then the results were averaged among all 3 tests. Before we get into this, I want to explain how to read these graphs. On the y-axis, we have the average frames per second, and on the x-axis, we have our test conditions. These include DirectX 11 on the left, DirectX 12 in the center, and DirectX 12 Plus, which is the DirectX 12 with the multi-threading capabilities enabled in the config file. The blue backslash are tests at 1080p, the red / are tests at 1440p, and the green with white polka dots is the 4K test. The black tick marks at the top of each bar indicate the error range for each test, and of course the error range was very, very low for this test since we weren't moving our character. Now, the interesting thing here is across the DirectX 11, DirectX 12, and DirectX 12 Plus with multi-threading enabled, we can see that 4K tends to be a little bit, just slightly lower FPS than the other two conditions, the 1080p or 1440p. But the interesting takeaway here is we look at the DirectX 12 with the multi-threaded capabilities enabled on the far right, there's a pretty obvious increase in average frame time. The average frame rate increases from about 31 frames per second at DirectX 11 all the way up to around 38 frames per second at DirectX 12 with multi-threading enabled. This represents roughly a 23% increase in frame rate, which is to me very significant and a really cool result of this very quick test. Now, I also looked at the 1% lows, and this roughly represents the average frame rate of the lowest 1% of frames. This is not your minimum, but a much better representation of what the minimum can feel like for players. With the DirectX 11, we had roughly around 25 to 26 frames per second as the lowest 1% of frames. DirectX 12 really made no improvement on that, but when we enabled the multi-threading in DirectX 12, we would see around 31 to 32 frames per second at the low end. This 1% low increase was roughly the same as the average frame rate, and it was about a 22% increase to the 1% lows, which means that not only will your frame rate feel better on average with DirectX 12 multi-threading enabled, but even your low-end frame rate will feel a lot better, and overall you'll have a much smoother experience when playing with DirectX 12 multi-threading enabled. I'm a big fan of active benchmarking, which means while my benchmark is running, I'm also monitoring CPU usage in the background. So this first chart is 1080p only, and we have a red bar that indicates DirectX 11, the middle bar, which is kind of a pinkish color, indicates DirectX 12, and the right sidebar, which is green, indicates DirectX 12 with multithreading enabled. On the x-axis, you can see the various tests or various aspects of my computer I was monitoring at the time, and on the y-axis I have either a raw number, such as 10, or a percentage, which would be 10%. So looking at our first set of columns, the threads used greater than 15%, this indicates the number of threads at any given time throughout the benchmark that were pushed to at least 15% of their maximum capacity. So for example, the red bar DirectX 11, we see about 12 threads were used at greater than 15%. That does not mean that 12 threads were simultaneously used at 12%, but just across the board, one thread might have been used for 15% for 10 seconds, and another thread for 15% or more for 10 seconds, and by the end of the test, at least 12 different threads at one point or another had been used to at least 15% of their maximum capacity. This isn't a test of simultaneous usage, again, just overall the spread of the load across the entire benchmark. And so we can see that in DirectX 12 overall, it seemed like more threads are being used at a time, here or there individually, to at least 15% of their capacity, which is pretty low. So what this means is that even though my processor was a 32-thread processor, the majority of threads in 1080p at DirectX 11 were never used at all. They were pretty much sat idly. When I moved to DirectX 12 or DirectX 12 with multithreading, they were the same at just about 16 of my total 32 threads were used at some point. So even while sitting here and while only half the threads were used at all, ever, of my 32 threads, even though these were not simultaneous use. So it's actually not that great. Then we move over 25% usage. The number of threads that saw at least 25% usage was extremely low. We're talking fewer than 5 total throughout the entire benchmark. And then finally, were there any threads that were being used at pretty much 100% capacity? And in all 3 tests, only a single thread ever was being pegged to 95 to 100%. That one thread stayed actively used at greater than 95% the entire time. So just like WoW in DirectX 11, there's always one thread that is just getting hammered by the game, and I think that's exactly what we're still seeing even with the multi-threaded improvements. Moving down the line, we see the top core max clock, so whatever core was used the most, in this case there's a single core being used at least, or single thread being used at least 95%, that thread, its clock speed, they were across the board 4.3 gigahertz, so they all pretty much leveled out at 4.3 or 4.325 gigahertz. Finally, we have the total CPU average usage percent and the total CPU max usage percentage. Total CPU average usage essentially means what percent of my total processing power capable by my CPU was being used, and the DirectX 11 test showed that only 6% on average of my entire CPU was being used at any given time on average. And the DirectX 12 with multithreading, we're using up to 10% of the entire processing power of my computer on average. And the maximum amount on the right shows what was the peak, what was the most ever being used by the processor at any given time during the test. There's really very little difference here. We see DirectX 11 was around 11% total processor usage at the very most, and DirectX 12 was around 12% with or without multithreading. We open the test up now for 1440p and 4K resolutions. And 1440p in the bottom left, it's a little conflicting because we notice the DirectX 12 seems to drop down for threads used at greater than 15%. For some reason, only 11 were used, whereas in the 1080p test, about 16 were used. However, the DirectX 11 and DirectX 12 with multithreading increased a little bit. Across the board, I will just summarize these slides as saying that nothing was very obvious to me. So I want to present these data for other people to maybe try and pull something out of it. Across all of my tests, there was never a scenario where more than one thread was pushed to 95% or greater. It was always just a single thread being really pegged to nearly 100%, and that was it. So although it seems like WoW has some new improvements for multi-threading enabled with DirectX 12, it is still not really pushing multi-threaded capabilities in the way that we think of with a modern game, and maybe that's the best we can expect from a game first developed all the way back in 2001, bandage fixed along the way. It's a little disappointing. Although I'm not a developer, I can't speak to how difficult it would be to truly engage multiple cores at the same time. I'm still quite happy that we see some improvement. And to be honest, if we're getting around a 20% improvement across all 3 resolutions, that's not anything to sneeze at, and that is pretty valuable. I really wanted to run this test because my CPU has 16 cores and 32 threads, and I thought it would be a great CPU to test and see, what is the upper limit of what WoW can take advantage of now. And I think it's pretty clear that really anything beyond even a 4-core, 8-thread processor, I don't think we'll see any benefit in WoW, and I'm not even sure 8 threads are really being taken advantage of. Although my data didn't really assess simultaneous thread usage, I did kind of qualitatively look at some graphs that were going during my benchmarking, and I never got the impression that really more than 8 threads were ever being used simultaneously, and that's across the entire system for other system uses also, and even then it was pretty low usage in many cases. Ultimately, we only saw a single thread ever being used at full capacity, essentially. With all this in mind, there's really no downside to these changes as far as I can tell. For people that have hardware capable of running DirectX 12, they're gonna see a frame rate boost, and that, at the end of the day, is a good thing. However, for me personally, what I'm excited about, we know that Classic WoW is going to not just be pure vanilla, it's going to be modernized in some ways, including the underlying architecture. And if that upgrade, if that modernization includes DirectX 12 and these multi-threaded improvements, we're going to see some pretty nice frame rate boosts, and that's really nice. I know it's a very old game, and modern hardware should run it really well, but because the game was really pretty strictly limited to just about a single thread usage, and in the past 14 years, single core, single thread improvements have been not that drastic. We really have seen more advancements in multi-threaded capabilities for processors. I think Classic WoW, if it runs on DirectX 12 and we have these same modernizations enabled, we're going to see some frame rate boosts. That's going to be really nice. It's going to be incredibly helpful in raid environments and incredibly helpful in Ironforge. Personally, that's one of the things I'm most excited about, is to see how this change is implemented into Classic WoW, and especially if we can see this change in the Classic WoW demo at BlizzCon 2018. That is all for this video. Thank you guys for watching, hope you enjoyed it, and if you have any questions about my testing methodology or any other tests you'd like me to run, please post them in the comments below and I will do my best to answer your questions. Are you into voodoo?
Voodoo.
Great. Is there anything you need?
I need clothes.
Then you should check out Voodoo Realm. Voodoo Realm has hats, t-shirts, sweatshirts, and more. With both men's and women's apparel, you can challenge yourself to step into the void at voodoo-realm.com.
Very well. You earn me trust. I call you friend.